You can tell when something shifts in professional sports. There's no alarm, no public argument, no official statement admitting it. Just a quiet change in tone. And that's exactly what happened the moment Caitlin Clark's name appeared in an NBC announcement. On the surface, it looked harmless. A rising WNBA star joining a national NBA broadcast as a special contributor. Smart move. Great exposure. Positive headline. But inside the Indiana Fever organization, that headline carried weight. Because this wasn't just media expansion. It was leverage. For decades, the hierarchy in professional basketball has been clear. Teams control messaging. Front offices manage image. Players operate within a defined structure. If tensions rise, they're handled privately. If narratives form, the organization shapes them. That structure works, until the player becomes larger than the structure itself. Caitlin Clark isn't just a rookie anymore. She's a ratings driver. She's a ticket multiplier. She's a brand with national pull that stretches far beyond Indiana. And now, she has a mainstream broadcast platform that exists outside team influence. That's the part people are missing. NBC isn't a team partner. It isn't a franchise-controlled outlet. It isn't filtered through the Fever's communications department. It's independent visibility. And independent visibility changes dynamics behind closed doors. Because once a player has a microphone that big, authority shifts, even if no one says it out loud. Imagine trying to operate under traditional front office discipline when the face of your franchise can step onto a national stage at any moment. Imagine navigating internal disagreements knowing that public opinion now moves faster than your press releases. This isn't about rebellion. It's about evolution. Clark didn't demand control. She expanded. But expansion, in a structured hierarchy, can feel like defiance. Inside any legacy organization, authority depends on leverage. Leverage comes from contracts, media access, and financial dependency. When those pillars weaken, leadership must adapt. And that's where tension begins. Because Clark's rookie contract doesn't define her value. Her endorsements don't depend on the Fever. Her visibility no longer relies solely on WNBA broadcasts. That creates a new reality. The franchise still owns her contract. But it no longer owns the spotlight. And once the spotlight becomes independent, control becomes collaborative. Collaboration requires adjustment. Adjustment creates friction. Reports of frustration inside the Fever front office aren't about one announcement. They're about what that announcement represents, a shift from centralized authority to shared influence. For executives who built careers in an era of strict hierarchy, that shift is destabilizing. For a 22-year-old who grew up building brand equity alongside basketball skill, it's normal. That's the collision. Old guard control meets modern athlete autonomy. And the NBC announcement accelerated it. Because now, the world isn't just watching Clark play. It's watching how Indiana handles her power. And power in sports rarely redistributes quietly. This isn't the end of a season. It's the beginning of a power recalibration. The question isn't whether Caitlin Clark will dominate headlines next year. The question is whether the Indiana Fever are ready to operate in a world where their biggest asset doesn't need them for visibility. And that question changes everything. For years, professional basketball followed a simple rule. The team is the platform. Players rotate through it. Coaches adjust it. Executives protect it. But Caitlin Clark didn't enter the WNBA needing a platform. She arrived with one. College dominance had already made her a national figure. Corporate sponsors were already aligned. Television networks were already invested in her visibility. By the time she put on a Fever jersey, she wasn't introducing herself to the sports world. She was expanding into it. That difference is critical. Most rookies spend their first season trying to earn attention. Clark spent hers absorbing it. Road arenas sold out when Indiana traveled. Broadcast windows shifted to accommodate Fever games. Opposing teams marketed matchups around her arrival. When that happens, internal dynamics shift quietly. Because the franchise realizes something unusual. The player is driving the machine. That realization doesn't create celebration inside a front office. It creates caution. Front offices prefer predictable development curves. They prefer gradual star growth. They prefer control over narrative pacing. Clark didn't follow that curve. She accelerated it. And acceleration forces adaptation. Now layer in the NBC announcement. The moment Clark stepped into a national broadcast role, she crossed an invisible threshold. She wasn't just the centerpiece of Indiana's rebuild anymore. She became part of the broader basketball conversation. NBA adjacent, mainstream adjacent, culturally relevant beyond the WNBA ecosystem. That adjacency matters. It signals that her influence isn't confined to one league, which means it isn't confined to one franchise. And once a player's influence expands beyond the franchise boundary, authority becomes shared. The Fever can control minutes. They can control rotations. They can control practice schedules. But they can't control narrative gravity. Clark's interviews trend whether the team promotes them or not. Her highlights circulate whether the franchise pushes them or not. Her commentary reaches audiences who may never watch a Fever game. That's new territory. Historically, WNBA franchises shaped their stars. Now, Clark shapes the franchise's visibility. That inversion unsettles traditional power structures. Because power in sports has always depended on dependency. If a player depends on you for exposure, you hold leverage. If a player depends on you for income, you hold leverage. If a player depends on you for long-term relevance, you hold leverage. Clark's situation disrupts all three. She entered the league with exposure. Her endorsement portfolio provides insulation. Her cultural relevance extends beyond box scores. So what exactly anchors her to Indiana? Alignment. That's it. Not necessity. Alignment. And alignment is fragile. It requires trust. It requires shared vision. It requires mutual respect. If that alignment cracks, the franchise doesn't lose just a player. It risks losing momentum. This is the silent pressure inside the building. Not anger. Not shouting matches. Just awareness. Awareness that the traditional model of team first, star follows no longer applies. Clark is not replaceable in the conventional sense. Her on-court production is valuable. But her off-court gravity is transformational. When attendance surges triple digits, executives notice. When merchandise spikes nationally, ownership notices. When broadcasters request scheduling priority, the league notices. Indiana knows this. And knowing it changes how they operate. Imagine negotiating roster construction. Do you build around balance? Or do you maximize Clark's strengths aggressively? Imagine managing practice intensity. Do you treat her like any other sophomore? Or do you factor in her expanding obligations and national schedule? Imagine handling internal disagreements. Do you enforce hierarchy? Or do you collaborate more than tradition might dictate? Every answer now carries amplified consequence. Because Clark doesn't operate inside a vacuum. She operates inside a spotlight. And spotlights make friction visible. This isn't about ego. It's about structure. Indiana was built on a structured model. Clark represents a fluid one. Structured systems value stability. Fluid ecosystems value adaptability. When the two intersect, leadership must evolve. If it doesn't, tension builds. The NBC announcement didn't create that tension. It revealed it. It signaled to everyone, inside and outside the league, that Clark's influence extends beyond the hardwood. She can analyze NBA strategy. She can sit beside mainstream commentators. She can exist in spaces that historically excluded WNBA players. That's progress for the sport. But progress changes power distribution. And power distribution changes internal confidence. If Clark ever disagrees with a strategic direction, she doesn't need to go public to apply pressure. Public perception already leans toward her influence. Fans don't debate whether she matters. They debate whether the franchise is maximizing her. That's a subtle but important shift. Instead of asking, is Clark good enough? The conversation now asks, is Indiana good enough? That reversal places executives under scrutiny. And scrutiny reshapes behavior. It makes leadership more cautious. It makes decisions more calculated. It makes internal discussions more tense. Because no one wants to be the executive remembered for mishandling a generational moment. Clark's rise isn't controversial. It's undeniable. The question is whether the Fever's internal structure can keep pace with her trajectory. Because trajectory doesn't slow down to accommodate comfort. It forces evolution. And evolution inside legacy systems is rarely smooth. This isn't about collapse. It's about recalibration. The Fever aren't losing control. They're negotiating a new version of it. And negotiating control with a 22-year-old who understands her value is unfamiliar territory for many traditional sports executives. That unfamiliarity is where tension lives. Quiet, unspoken, but real. And we're only at the beginning of that recalibration. Next, we go deeper into the element that amplifies all of this. Money. Because once financial independence enters the equation, power shifts permanently. In professional sports, control usually follows the contract. The franchise signs you. The franchise pays you. The franchise sets expectations. That model works when the paycheck defines the player's security. But Caitlin Clark's financial reality doesn't fit that mold. Her WNBA rookie contract is structured by the collective bargaining agreement. It's standardized. It's capped. It reflects league economics, not individual market pull. And that's where the imbalance begins. Because Clark's market pull doesn't resemble a typical second-year player. National endorsement deals. Apparel partnerships. Major brand visibility. Broadcast integration. Merchandise velocity. Her financial ecosystem exists outside the boundaries of Indiana's payroll sheet. And when your primary earning power doesn't come from the franchise, the dynamic changes immediately. You can't pressure someone financially when they're already insulated. You can't threaten long-term stability when long-term stability is diversified. You can't subtly imply, remember who pays you, when the largest checks don't come from you. That's the structural shift happening here. Most rookies need the team. Clark benefits from the team, but she doesn't depend on it for relevance or wealth. That difference alters negotiation psychology. Imagine a disagreement over usage. If a typical player pushes back, management can lean on contract terms, future extensions, or role stability. With Clark, that leverage feels lighter. She doesn't have to escalate conflict to apply influence. Her independence already does that quietly. Financial insulation creates emotional insulation. And emotional insulation creates confidence. Confidence isn't confrontation. It's posture. Clark doesn't have to demand anything aggressively. She simply operates knowing she has options. Options are powerful. Options shift tone in meetings. Options soften ultimatums. Options increase the likelihood of collaboration instead of command. From a front office perspective, that can feel destabilizing. Not because they fear her, but because they recognize the limits of traditional control. In earlier eras, if tension grew between a star and management, the franchise often held the upper hand. Trade market leverage. Contract leverage. Media leverage. Today, Clark's brand carries independent gravitational pull. If she were ever to express frustration, even diplomatically, public sympathy would likely lean toward her. Sponsors would watch closely. Media would amplify. Fans would mobilize. That doesn't mean she plans to challenge authority. It means authority must now be exercised differently. Instead of relying on financial hierarchy, leadership must rely on trust. Trust is harder to enforce than salary. It requires transparency. It requires alignment. It requires consistent communication. If Indiana mishandles communication, they don't just risk locker room discomfort. They risk narrative momentum shifting. And once narrative momentum shifts in the digital era, it spreads rapidly. The salary gap also influences perception internally. Teammates operate under the same pay scale. They understand Clark's commercial value. They see the endorsement campaigns. They see the national features. They see the expanded visibility. That awareness can create two reactions: admiration or comparison. Front offices must manage that balance carefully. If Clark receives preferential treatment due to brand value, resentment can grow. If she's treated identically to every other player despite disproportionate market impact, inefficiency can grow. Neither path is simple. And that's what makes this moment delicate. Clark's financial independence forces Indiana to modernize leadership style. Because the old formula of control through contract doesn't fully apply. Now consider the broader implications. If Clark's trajectory continues upward, if her brand expands alongside performance, the salary structure conversation intensifies league-wide. Agents notice. Other players notice. Future draft picks notice. Clark becomes proof that individual market value can eclipse collective compensation frameworks. That reality strengthens player empowerment narratives. And player empowerment narratives reduce centralized authority. This is not about greed. It's about evolution. The WNBA's economic model is expanding. Clark's presence accelerates that expansion. But acceleration exposes gaps faster. Indiana stands at the center of that exposure. They are managing a player whose commercial footprint stretches beyond traditional containment. They must balance on-court development, brand expansion, team chemistry, league politics, and they must do it without relying on the old anchor of financial leverage. That's new territory. And new territory creates tension, even when everyone is acting professionally. Imagine a scenario where Clark wants to prioritize off-season recovery due to media commitments. Management prefers aggressive training. The conversation changes when financial necessity isn't part of the equation. It becomes strategic alignment rather than obligation. That requires diplomacy. Diplomacy under spotlight is difficult. Because fans interpret everything. Every minute restriction. Every substitution. Every public comment. And if something appears misaligned with Clark's growth, speculation accelerates. The Fever don't just manage basketball now. They manage perception in real time. Clark's financial ecosystem gives her resilience. But it also increases organizational vulnerability. Because when one asset becomes irreplaceable economically, protecting that asset becomes paramount. And protecting it without appearing controlled is a tightrope walk. This isn't about collapse. It's about recalibration. Indiana must shift from authority-driven leadership to influence-driven leadership. Influence requires persuasion. Persuasion requires respect. Respect requires alignment. Alignment isn't automatic. It must be cultivated continuously. Clark's independence ensures she cannot be taken for granted. And that forces excellence from management, which is good for growth, but stressful in execution. The salary gap isn't just a talking point. It's the foundation of this new power structure. And once power structures shift financially, they rarely revert. Next, we move into the moment where adaptation became visible to everyone. The coaching change. Because when leadership shifts under a spotlight, it signals more than strategy. It signals pressure. When Indiana changed coaches, the headline looked simple. New voice. New direction. Fresh start. That's how these announcements are always framed. But context matters. Because this wasn't a rebuilding team operating quietly in the background. This was the most watched team in the league. Every rotation decision had already been dissected on social media. Every offensive set had been clipped, slowed down, debated, and replayed 1,000 times. And at the center of every debate was one question. Is Indiana maximizing Caitlin Clark? That question is dangerous. Not because it accuses anyone directly, but because it reframes responsibility. When fans stop asking, is the rookie adjusting? And start asking, is the organization adjusting? Authority shifts. Throughout the season, criticism of Indiana's pace surfaced repeatedly. Analysts questioned spacing. Fans pointed out possessions where Clark looked like she was playing slower than her natural rhythm. There were stretches where the offense seemed structured for control rather than explosion. Maybe that was intentional development. Maybe it was strategic patience. But perception doesn't wait for explanation. And perception built momentum. By the time the coaching change happened, it didn't feel random. It felt reactive. When a franchise replaces leadership during a visibility surge, it signals urgency. Urgency means pressure. Pressure means expectations have already escalated. Bringing in a new coach wasn't just about improving schemes. It was about aligning the franchise timeline with Clark's timeline. And those timelines aren't normal. Most stars grow into systems gradually. Clark arrived with a system already built around her brand. That compresses the adjustment window. Indiana didn't have 3 quiet seasons to experiment. They had national cameras from day one. That kind of exposure accelerates accountability. When you operate under a microscope, patience shrinks. If the offense stalls for 2 games, it trends. If Clark looks frustrated for 1 quarter, it becomes content. That's the environment the new coaching staff inherited. And here's where the tension deepens. When management makes a coaching change during a superstar's rise, 2 narratives form simultaneously. Narrative 1. The organization is adapting to maximize generational talent. Narrative 2. The organization felt forced to adapt because they were falling behind. Even if the truth sits somewhere in the middle, perception fuels speculation. And speculation fuels pressure. Because if the new coach succeeds immediately, the previous structure looks outdated. If struggles continue, leadership looks unstable. There's no neutral outcome. The coaching switch becomes symbolic. Symbolic of flexibility. Or symbolic of fragility. That duality is exhausting for a front office. They must project confidence while adjusting behind the scenes. They must reassure veterans that culture remains intact. They must reassure Clark that her trajectory is central. And they must do all of it while national visibility expands. Now imagine how this interacts with the NBC development. Clark isn't just a player inside a rebuilding team anymore. She's a basketball personality stepping into mainstream analysis. If Indiana struggles early next season, the conversation won't stay inside WNBA circles. It will bleed into broader basketball discourse. And when that happens, the coaching move becomes part of a larger narrative about whether the franchise can keep pace with its star. That's heavy, because it shifts the lens. Instead of asking whether Clark can carry Indiana, the conversation starts asking whether Indiana can support Clark. That's a profound reversal of traditional power dynamics. The coaching decision wasn't necessarily driven by conflict. But it was driven by reality. The reality that the franchise's margin for stagnation disappeared. Clark's presence removed the luxury of slow experimentation. Every season now carries amplified stakes. And amplified stakes make leadership feel exposed. Exposed leadership can react defensively. Or it can evolve. Which path Indiana chooses will determine whether this moment becomes foundational growth or lingering friction. The most important part? Clark didn't publicly demand anything. She didn't issue ultimatums. But when a player's influence is this large, adaptation often happens without public requests. Because executives understand the consequences of misalignment. The coaching move signaled that Indiana understands this era is different. But understanding it intellectually and navigating it emotionally are not the same thing. Behind every strategic adjustment is a quiet acknowledgement. We cannot afford to waste this moment. And that acknowledgement creates internal pressure. Pressure builds. Pressure compresses timelines. Pressure forces faster decisions. And faster decisions increase the risk of friction. That's where we are now. The franchise isn't collapsing. It's accelerating. And acceleration without total alignment creates tension. Next, we move into the most emotional layer of this entire situation. Not contracts, not coaching, but perception on the court. Because sometimes the loudest shifts begin with silence. The numbers were historic. The attention was overwhelming. But what people remember most from that season wasn't just assists or logo threes. It was contact. Hard contact. The kind that makes arenas gasp. The kind that sends social media into slow-motion breakdown mode. Every time Caitlin Clark hit the floor, cameras zoomed in. Every time she absorbed a shoulder check, the replay circulated instantly. Every time there was a questionable non-call, hashtags followed. And then came the real shift. Not in officiating. In perception. Because fans weren't just watching the referees. They were watching Indiana. They were watching the bench. They were watching management. They were waiting for visible defense of their star. And what they often saw was restraint. Professional comments. Measured responses. Careful language about physical play and competitive balance. From a front office standpoint, that approach makes sense. Publicly criticizing officiating invites fines. Escalating disputes invites league scrutiny. Overreacting invites instability. But in the era of viral clips and instant outrage, silence can feel like indifference. That's the emotional layer most executives underestimate. Fans don't measure internal conversations. They measure visible solidarity. And for Clark's rapidly expanding fan base, visible solidarity felt inconsistent. Was she being targeted? Was it just rookie adjustment? Was it league intensity? The debate never fully settled. But the emotional momentum tilted toward one belief. She was absorbing more than she should have. And the organization didn't say enough. Whether that belief was entirely fair isn't the point. Perception shapes narrative. Narrative shapes loyalty. And loyalty drives leverage. Clark supporters are fiercely protective. They mobilize quickly. They amplify instantly. If they sense that she's navigating physical pressure alone, they respond emotionally. That emotional response matters. Because Clark's independence, financially and now media-wise, gives her the option to frame experiences in her own words. She doesn't need confrontation. She doesn't need drama. A calm reflection on physicality during a national segment could reignite every debate from last season. And once those debates resurface under a larger spotlight, Indiana becomes part of the story again. That possibility lingers. It doesn't need to materialize to create pressure. The knowledge that it could happen is enough. Front offices fear hindsight narratives more than current criticism. In the moment, restraint looks professional. Months later, restraint can look like neglect. If Clark ever says, even subtly, it was an adjustment and I learned a lot, the internet interprets subtext. If she says, there were moments I didn't feel fully protected, the amplification multiplies. And Indiana must respond under even brighter lights. This is why the protection issue matters more than box scores. It's about emotional alignment. Did Clark feel supported internally? Did she feel the organization stood behind her unequivocally? If the answer is yes, tension diffuses quietly. If the answer is complicated, that complication lingers beneath the surface. And lingering tension paired with growing leverage becomes combustible. The NBC platform increases that sensitivity. Because now Clark exists in national basketball spaces that transcend the league's internal messaging. If controversial officiating resurfaces next season, and Clark comments in a broader media setting, the conversation won't remain contained. It will expand. That's what makes silence powerful. Silence in the moment can feel safe. Silence under hindsight can feel costly. Indiana likely believed it handled the season responsibly. Avoid escalation. Stay disciplined. Trust internal processes. But Clark's rise accelerated expectations for visible advocacy. The league wasn't just watching her performance. It was watching how she was treated. And when a star becomes symbolic of growth, every interaction carries weight. Physical play becomes narrative. Bench reactions become narrative. Press conference tone becomes narrative. Clark didn't ask to be a symbol. But growth made her one. And symbols require careful handling. If Indiana underestimated how deeply fans tie protection to loyalty, that gap could widen quietly. If they recognized it and strengthened internal trust, stability returns. We don't see private conversations. We see body language. And in the modern era, body language becomes content. One moment of visible frustration can trend globally. One expression can fuel a week of commentary. That's the environment Indiana operates in now. The physical narrative wasn't just about fouls. It was about alignment. Did the franchise and its star feel united under pressure? That question matters more than any stat line. Because if Clark ever feels that she must defend herself publicly, the power shift accelerates. And when power shifts accelerate under national spotlight, leadership must adapt quickly. Next, we move into the factor that multiplies all of this tension: optionality. Because when a superstar has real alternatives, every decision carries more weight. For most of professional sports history, stars didn't really have options. They had contracts. They had trade requests. They had overseas seasons. But structurally, the league was the league. If you wanted to compete at the highest level, you played within the system. You didn't operate outside of it. That's no longer true. The emergence of new platforms, especially domestic ones, changed the equation. Not because they replaced the WNBA, but because they introduced something far more disruptive than competition. They introduced choice. And choice is leverage. When Unrivaled launched as a high-profile 3-on-3 league backed by elite players and significant compensation, it wasn't just another off-season tournament. It was a signal. A signal that players could expand their earning power and visibility without depending entirely on traditional league structures. Even though Caitlin Clark chose not to participate, the significance wasn't in her decision. It was in the fact that she could decide. That's the shift. She wasn't waiting for permission. She wasn't negotiating survival. She wasn't forced into a single pathway. She evaluated an opportunity and made a strategic choice. And that reality changes internal dynamics inside any franchise. Because once a superstar has viable alternatives, authority becomes shared by default. Imagine a scenario next season where Clark needs extended rest. In a traditional structure, the franchise dictates load management. But what if Clark balances multiple brand commitments? What if she prioritizes long-term health over short-term appearances? What if she evaluates exposure strategically? The conversation becomes negotiation, not instruction. That's unfamiliar territory for many front offices. Indiana historically operated in a centralized model. The team defines the calendar. The team sets the tone. The team holds the structure together. Clark exists in a decentralized ecosystem. Her brand doesn't pause when the season ends. Her visibility doesn't shrink in the off-season. Her influence doesn't depend solely on game nights. That creates flexibility. Flexibility creates independence. And independence alters tone in subtle ways. Management can no longer rely on exclusivity. They must rely on alignment. Alignment is harder. Because alignment requires constant communication. It requires understanding her long-term strategy. It requires respecting her autonomy while protecting team culture. And culture can fracture if other players perceive imbalance. That's where optionality becomes delicate. If Clark operates as a global brand while teammates operate within standard structures, comparison naturally forms. Front offices must manage that carefully. Too much accommodation and locker room tension grows. Too little flexibility and Clark's camp feels constrained. It's a tightrope. And tightropes feel thinner under bright lights. The presence of alternative platforms doesn't mean Clark intends to leave. It means she doesn't operate from scarcity. Scarcity drives compliance. Abundance drives confidence. Confidence is healthy for growth. But for leadership accustomed to top-down authority, confidence can feel destabilizing. Not threatening, just unfamiliar. Unrivaled, endorsements, NBC, these aren't isolated events. They form a network. A network that insulates Clark from traditional vulnerability. She doesn't have to react emotionally to apply influence. Her ecosystem does it quietly. And Indiana knows that. That awareness changes internal pacing. It makes executives more cautious with public messaging. It makes them more strategic with roster decisions. It increases sensitivity around public perception. Because if misalignment ever becomes visible, The fallout spreads faster than it used to. The league is evolving. Athletes now build empires alongside careers. Franchises must adapt to that reality. Some will thrive in this era. Others will struggle to relinquish centralized control. Indiana sits at the crossroads. They don't just manage a player. They manage a movement. And movements don't operate on traditional authority models. They operate on shared influence. Clark doesn't need to threaten departure. She doesn't need to hint at dissatisfaction. The mere presence of alternatives shifts negotiation power. That's the quiet tension. Not conflict. Possibility. Possibility is powerful. Because when leadership knows a star has options, leadership moves differently. It communicates differently. It calculates differently. And sometimes, it reacts defensively. The question isn't whether Clark will use her leverage aggressively. The question is whether Indiana can operate confidently in an era where exclusivity is gone. Because once exclusivity disappears, loyalty must be earned continuously. And earning loyalty requires flexibility. Next, we step into the human layer of all this, the generational contrast inside the building itself. Because power shifts aren't just structural. They're personal. Strip away the headlines. Remove the contracts. Ignore the television deals. At its core, this is a philosophical collision. On one side, you have leadership shaped in a different basketball era. An era built on hierarchy. Where rookies earned status slowly. Where authority flowed clearly from the front office to the locker room. Where the franchise identity always came first, and players fit inside it. On the other side, you have Caitlin Clark. A player who entered professional basketball already functioning like a brand executive. Already understanding media leverage. Already comfortable balancing corporate relationships alongside team obligations. Already fluent in the language of audience metrics, digital visibility, and brand positioning. That contrast isn't dramatic on paper. But inside a building, it changes everything. Legacy leadership believes in structure. Modern athletes believe in agency. Structure says, trust the process. Agency says, let's discuss the process. Structure prefers internal handling. Agency is comfortable with transparency. Neither philosophy is wrong. But they don't always move at the same speed. Clark's rise wasn't gradual. It was explosive. Explosive growth compresses timelines. Front offices that prefer slow evolution suddenly have to operate in accelerated mode. That acceleration can feel destabilizing, not because they oppose her success, but because it forces adaptation at a pace they didn't choose. Imagine being an executive who has spent decades building systems carefully. Now imagine that within one season, a 22-year-old player reshapes the entire visibility arc of your franchise. Attendance shifts. Broadcast windows shift. National discussion shifts. The spotlight tilts. When the spotlight tilts, credit tilts too. Executives who once operated quietly in the background now find their decisions dissected publicly. Instead of being architects behind the curtain, they become characters in the story. That's uncomfortable for anyone who built authority through discretion. Clark, meanwhile, doesn't see this as disruption. For her generation, this is normal. Athletes today grow up with nil opportunities in college. They learn early that personal brand and performance operate side by side. They don't see autonomy as rebellion, they see it as professionalism. That mindset difference creates subtle friction. Legacy executives may interpret autonomy as impatience. Modern athletes interpret hierarchy as rigidity. Neither side necessarily voices it. But it lingers. The NBC announcement amplified that generational contrast. To Clark, joining a major broadcast platform likely feels like natural progression. Expand reach. Analyze the game. Elevate visibility for women's basketball. To traditional leadership, it signals decentralization. And decentralization means authority must be shared. Shared authority requires humility. Humility in leadership isn't weakness, but it requires adjustment. It means recognizing that the franchise identity is no longer defined solely by executives. It's co-defined by its star. That's new territory for many organizations. It also affects locker room dynamics. Other players watch closely. If Clark operates with expanded autonomy, they assess what that means for team culture. Does it create a two-tiered structure? Does it strengthen collective exposure? Does it shift expectations? Management must ensure cohesion doesn't fracture. That's not easy when one player's visibility dwarfs the rest of the roster. The generational contrast doesn't guarantee conflict, but it guarantees tension, because adaptation requires ego recalibration. Executives must accept that control now looks different. Clark must balance autonomy with unity. That's delicate. The difference between empowerment and imbalance can be razor thin. And under national scrutiny, that razor gets sharper. Clark didn't create this shift alone. Market forces did. Audience demand did. The digital era did. But she embodies it. She is the visible face of modern athlete empowerment in the WNBA. And Indiana represents institutional legacy. When legacy meets evolution, friction isn't scandalous. It's natural. The real question is whether that friction becomes creative tension, the kind that fuels growth, or defensive tension, the kind that slows it. Creative tension builds collaboration. Defensive tension builds walls. We don't see private meetings. We don't hear unfiltered conversations. But we can see posture. And posture tells stories. If leadership leans into this era, Indiana becomes the blueprint for managing modern superstars. If leadership resists, pressure accumulates quietly. Pressure rarely explodes overnight. It builds through small moments. Tone shifts in interviews. Subtle body language on the sidelines. Carefully worded comments that hint at underlying recalibration. The generational clash isn't loud. It's nuanced. And nuance is harder to navigate than open confrontation. Because you can't solve nuance with ultimatums. You solve it with trust. Trust requires both sides to adapt. Clark must recognize the importance of culture. Management must recognize the importance of autonomy. That balance determines whether this era becomes historic success or prolonged tension. And the entire league is watching how Indiana handles it. Because what happens here sets precedent. Next, we zoom out completely. Beyond Indiana. Beyond Clark. Into the league-wide implications of a superstar whose influence expands faster than the structure around her. Step back from Indiana for a moment. Zoom out. Because what's happening here isn't just a team adjusting to a star. It's a league adjusting to a new power structure. For years, the WNBA fought for visibility. Now it has it. For years, the league asked for national respect. Now it's being debated on mainstream platforms. For years, executives wanted a player who could break through into broader basketball culture. Now they have one. But breakthroughs come with consequences. Because once a league's growth becomes closely tied to one face, one name, one gravitational force, control becomes fragile. Not because that player is dangerous, but because dependency shifts upward. If Caitlin Clark thrives, the league thrives faster. If Caitlin Clark appears misaligned with her franchise, the headlines don't read internal tension. They read league instability. That's pressure. Pressure on Indiana. Pressure on the league office. Pressure on ownership. Clark didn't ask for that weight. But momentum placed it on her shoulders. The NBC announcement amplified it. She's no longer only a WNBA storyline. She's a basketball storyline. And that changes the stakes. If she comments on officiating, it spreads wider. If she reflects on team alignment, it carries heavier. If she praises Indiana's support, it stabilizes narratives. If she appears distant, speculation grows. This is why front offices tread carefully. Because in modern sports, perception moves markets. Markets influence revenue. Revenue influences expansion. And expansion defines long-term stability. Indiana's handling of Clark isn't just about one season. It's about whether franchises can evolve fast enough to support a new type of superstar. A superstar who is financially insulated, media integrated, digitally amplified, and culturally significant beyond her stat line. That archetype didn't exist in the WNBA before. Now it does. And once it exists, you can't pretend it doesn't. Clark represents the prototype of the next generation. Players entering the league now will study this moment. They'll watch how Indiana balances authority and autonomy. They'll watch how the league reacts to expanded player platforms. They'll decide whether this era empowers them or restricts them. That's why this isn't about drama. It's about precedent. If Indiana embraces collaborative leadership, they become pioneers. If they resist adaptation, they become a warning. The quiet reports of frustration inside the front office aren't necessarily explosions. They're growing pains. Growing pains of an institution adjusting to a new gravity. Because gravity has shifted. The franchise used to be the center. Now the star shares that center. And shared centers require shared control. Control in modern sports isn't about dominance. It's about alignment. Clark doesn't need to overpower Indiana. She simply needs to remain confident in her ecosystem. Indiana doesn't need to suppress Clark. They need to integrate her autonomy into the team's identity. If that integration works, this becomes the blueprint for a new era. If it fractures, the consequences ripple outward. The league is expanding. Media deals are growing. Salaries will eventually rise. And when that happens, historians may look back at this moment as the turning point. The moment when player empowerment in women's basketball accelerated visibly. The moment when franchises had to decide, protect tradition, or evolve with the market. Clark's NBC announcement wasn't the cause. It was the catalyst. It revealed the structural tension already forming. And catalysts don't explode things. They expose them. Now here's the real question. Will Indiana treat Clark as an asset to manage? Or as a partner to build with? That answer determines everything. Because in modern sports, superstars rarely lose power struggles. Not through threats. Through gravity. And Clark's gravity is undeniable. The next season won't just measure points per game. It will measure alignment. Body language on the sidelines. Tone in press conferences. Subtle signals of unity or distance. The spotlight isn't shrinking. It's expanding. And how Indiana navigates this expansion will define whether this era becomes historic growth or prolonged tension. If you've stayed through this entire breakdown, you're clearly not here for surface-level headlines. This channel is still growing, and every single subscriber genuinely matters at this stage. If you want deeper structured analysis of the power shifts shaping women's basketball, not just hot takes, hit subscribe right now. Like the video so it reaches serious fans who want context, not chaos. And drop your thoughts in the comments. Is Indiana prepared for this new era of player leverage, or are we watching the early signs of a larger shift? Because this story isn't ending. It's evolving.